Hello and welcome to our special episode in collaboration with Haidian Park, China, the Art of Law, HPP Special, IP Strategy in China. I want to thank Haidian Park for this opportunity of hosting a special episode of the China Art of Law. Our speaker is Mark Schout, an international partner at King & Wood Medicines based in Shanghai, London, and Frankfurt. He is also the author of China, the Art of Law, a book that he wrote in 2005, all about Chinese law and business in China. Based off this book, we are currently doing a series. You can find this series on YouTube or on the KWN website. Thank you, Mark, for joining on this special episode in collaboration with Haidian Park. This special episode is all about IP in China. And going a little bit back in history, specifically back in 2005, when we look at IP in China, the American Chamber of Commerce back in 2005 held a survey amongst foreign companies in China. And out of that survey came that the most important concern about investing in China was intellectual property. It was rated the highest on the list. And I'm wondering, do you think that's still the same?
Yeah, so I think, well, thanks, Jerome. Thanks to the Haidian Park for organizing this. I think, maybe back in 2005 or even earlier, IP was a major issue, but I think it remains a major issue, but it's changed over the years. So it used to be just counterfeit. I think nowadays it's probably, on the one hand, the Chinese authorities and the Chinese courts have become much better at enforcing IP rights, and also it's become much more sophisticated, the IP protection systems in place, but also foreign companies actually do register their rights. So I think that's one aspect, but probably now with China becoming a tech power, there's also a whole new area of IP being problematic, and that's not so much perhaps counterfeiting, but it's more reverse engineering, whether Chinese companies are encroaching on Western companies' IP. So it's still perhaps number one or number two concern, but it's changed and it's a much more complex and sophisticated issue than it was 15 years ago.
Yeah, it seems to me that a lot of questions that I've noticed we also get is that a lot of foreign companies, first of all, they don't know much about intellectual property law to begin with in China. But the biggest issue, in my opinion, that I see is that they are afraid of the lack of enforcement of intellectual property. Is that something that they are correct in, or how do you see that?
So I think it's it's always going to be difficult. Enforcement's probably difficult in most jurisdictions, but in China, the additional issue is it's a vast country. I think with counterfeiters, it depends what kind of product. So, obviously if it's something which affects public health, the authorities will be, perhaps quicker on it. So I think there's a few things to say. First thing is, many Western companies didn't even take the minimum requirements of establishing their rights. So, how many companies have we met that haven't registered their trademarks, haven't registered their patents? And this puts you in an incredible disadvantage. I mean, it doesn't put you in a disadvantage, it means you can't really do anything. So I think that's one issue. And then I think secondly, because the country is very big, if we talk about counterfeiters, who still are a big issue, I think the problem is these counterfeiters are quite professional. They can move, and it's a bit like whack-a-mole. So, if you're like a fast-moving consumer goods company, it's difficult to go after the counterfeiter themselves because they can move, and there's so much production capacity in China. So in some ways, it's very difficult, but many foreign companies take a difficult situation and make it impossible by not putting in, the registrations in place. And then I think secondly, you have to look at things a little bit economically. So if you are a fast-moving consumer good company, you can't hit everybody who's counterfeiting you. So you have to work out what your budget is and go and think about how you can do it strategically. But for most companies who are making stuff, it's not the counterfeiters. That's what we always think when people think about IP infringements. It's somebody walking around with a fake Ralph Lauren t-shirt or something. But really, I think most of the IP issues nowadays are B2B, and it's sophisticated, copying or sophisticated infringements of patents and things like that.
Yeah, let's take a look at the different sections of intellectual property. Maybe you could walk us through about patents to begin with, and I'll drop in with some questions here and there.
Yeah, so I think the patent, I'm not a German patent lawyer, but I think the patent law system in China is similar to the German system in that it's got a utility model. So we have invention patents, which I think is a worldwide phenomenon. And I think with patent, and so we have an invention patent, which is the hardest to get. So you have to really show innovation. And this has a real substantive review by the Chinese Patent Office. Utility model is something which is less substantively looked at. The utility model goes to the inside of the actual invention, whereas a design patent is really just for the appearance of a product. So I think again, China is a first to file system also for patents, but that's not unusual because patents do not come about. A patent is basically a monopoly on an idea. And so, you have to actually go out and try to get it. So for an invention patent, you need novelty, creativity, and practicality, and you have to do a registration. And then you're granted, essentially a monopoly for 20 years for that invention patent. I think the biggest problem which people have is they don't register their patents in China. So I think, if you are a company and you're registering in North America and Europe, you probably will want to register the patent in China as well. And it's important, firstly, to protect your rights, to have your rights, but also for your business here. If you're setting up a WOFE or you're doing a technology licensing arrangement or something like that, it's not only just the protection that you get, but, to get tax benefits, to maybe claim bigger subsidies from the local governments, patents are something which are important. And if you don't do a patent, in China, actually, because of the way the Chinese unfair competition law works, basically they can use your patent and they're not breaching the law because there's no law against reverse engineering. To the contrary, reverse engineering in China is expressly allowed. So if you have a patent, because that involves, let's say you have an American patent, if you publish it on the website, you lose that aspect of novelty. And so you will not be able to register it within China. And so you have a grace period. So if you establish a patent overseas, you have a period of time in which to also register in China. And most people just get a Chinese patent lawyer to essentially translate their overseas patent. It's probably good to get somebody who's a little bit more familiar or a bit more expert because the laws are slightly different and there are advantages to be had by making it a little bit more bespoke. But main thing is if you've registered overseas, register in China. So I think that's, for patents, the main points.
So the first to file system, that means that if someone else filed an invention or patent that I have maybe in the USA, they have the rights to that patent in China, or how does that work?
Well, I mean, the patent, first of all, it's there. For trademarks, it's more important. But, for patents, there's no, patents, nowhere in the world is a patent going to just somehow be recognized unless you register the patent. Because, the patent is something where you go out and seek a monopoly. So, what we've had is, like I said, I think the invention patent is substantive. Utility model and design are normally much easier. And China's now the #1 country in the world for patents. And they are getting better, but maybe 10 years ago, you heard a lot about junk patents, which is still an issue today. And so, many Chinese partners would take, technology from their American, German, Japanese, British supplier and just basically seek to register them as utility model or design patents. And they were firstly doing that because there was a lot of government incentives to do that, but also a marketing incentive. But we did have cases where Chinese partners sought to use patents based on their overseas partners' technology and sought to cause them difficulty. So, so I think, the patents, you should register them in China. If you don't register them, it doesn't stop anyone else from actually registering the patents, because nobody will be able to check everything. But those patents will be relatively flawed, because you have to be, the foreign company will probably be able to show that it's not novel. But you don't need those kind of problems. So I guess that would be an issue, because a lot of people still think, IP infringement, it must be a counterfeit or something. Quite a lot of these disputes are with suppliers, and so it's important that you do have provisions about protecting your patents. And I would argue, which I probably will lose the argument, that it's good to have Chinese courts, because, if you've got a patent dispute or a trademark dispute, the court, especially with patents, will not really feel that they can deal with the technical issues. So they will no doubt connect with the patent authorities in China to do it. And so it's all a bit interlinked. So I understand arbitration and things like that.
I'd just like to ask you really quick about another thing regarding patents, that because you mentioned that if you have registered your patent in your home market, let's say I have a design patent, which I know that there's an international patent application process in The Hague. Let's say I've applied for that design patent there. Would I be able to enforce that in China?
Well, there is no international patent system. So patents are, by their nature, country specific. Copyright's international. So if you had a European patent, you would file a patent application within a grace period. So, we do have clients, and some of them come because they want to get high-tech status, and they have to have, stuff, in China. They have to show the technology's here. And so then they have to seek to create these patents. And a lot of them will be very flawed patents, no doubt. So I think the thing is, if you've got an invention patent in Europe and you wait too long, like you wait 2-3 years, and the grace period's run already in China, you will not be able to register that in China, because the authorities will do a substantive review. So it's very unlikely. But you might get through with a utility model or design patent because it's not as thorough a review. But this wouldn't stop anybody in China trying to do it. But again, it'll be fragile. So I think, patents are a little bit different from other types of rights, because, it's, the question isn't about whether you'll get a design patent registered, I think. It's more, when you try to enforce it, will it be fragile or will it be robust? That's the issue.
Okay, that's very clear. Thank you for that. Could you walk us through the trademark section? And I have a few questions I'd like to ask you, but please walk us through.
Yeah, so I think trademarks, are simple. It's relatively straightforward, and people understand it. I think the first thing is, in many legal systems around the world, you can have your trademark protected by first use, whereas in China, it is first to file. They have, improved the law from a foreign perspective, that, bad faith registrants can be overturned, but it's still very expensive. So, given this, it's important to, file for your trademark as soon as you can, even before you start business in China, before you start talking to distributors, because, very often it's, the trademark squatters are still out there, but they seem to be less common than they used to be. But what we see a lot is distributors, because, most of the big consumer brands would have their trademarks registered by now. And so I think, it's inexpensive. It's about $600 and per class, and that will give you 10 years protection. And so I think, it says there, the unregistered well-known trademark can be protected in China as well. It can be, but it's going to cost you a lot more money than $600 to prevail in the courts. And really by now, I don't know if there's many trademarks that are well-known in China. nobody's thought about registering. So, there's still those kind of issues. I guess what we see nowadays mostly is still people entering the market saying they don't have a Chinese name. And so I think that's something important. Before you enter the market, get somebody to come up with a Chinese name for you, make sure it's available, register it. And, last point, because I know you've got some questions, but, we did have a case last year with a beauty product from America. The logo was very bespoke. And, a Chinese company had registered it, and they kicked the American product out of Sephora because they were producing the same product under that brand, but they produced more of the product than the American company. So, it used to be counterfeiters or squatters, but increasingly there's a lot of companies who are registering it. We had another one, which is a European fashion brand. And, if you heard the European fashion brand's European name, the Chinese name was kind of obvious what you were coming up with. And somebody had registered it. But, that European brand never really had a Chinese name. And I think even the Chinese entrepreneur would have probably said he was influenced by the name, but he had set up a large business. So, basically the European company had to find a different name because he wasn't really a trademark squatter. He was just somebody who was inspired by a name 10 years ago, came up with a Chinese version and registered it. So long story short, register your, English or European language name, register your Chinese name as a trademark, and register often and early in all the relevant classes.
All right, that's a good tip. Just make sure to have a Chinese name. That's something that everyone can think about. I just want to ask you a question because I think that China adheres to the NIS classification system. You mentioned those classes, and I think there are 45 different classes of goods and services. Is there any distinct differences between those classes internationally, and what about subclasses?
Yeah, so I think that, so I'm not a trademark agent, but we've got a team in China who does this, all the time. And so I think, the classes, I mean, the first starting point is where you've registered in your home market, that'll probably be a good guide, what classes you will fall under in China as well. But like you mentioned, the subclasses, there are variations and there's differences. And so if you just do it by yourself without having someone who knows it, there is a risk of missing something in the subclass. But this risk is quite minor compared to the risk of the people who just don't register at all. And so I think, when you register, if it's the, European language version, there is a Madrid Treaty where you can do the registrations in China, just add it to the registrations. And that's probably the most, time and cost-effective solution for people. But that won't work for the Chinese trademark. So you're going to have to still deal with the Chinese trademark agent when you get that far.
Okay, so if you use your European name, let's say you could add that to the Madrid Treaty.
Yeah, but not the Chinese one.
Yeah.
And, and if you've got a very complex business, then, you bet. I mean, it used to be, we used to have people 10 years ago who would really we would do a trademark check on them. They even have a factory in China manufacturing, the one I'm thinking of in particular. They were a car parts supplier in Shenyang, and it was a German company, and they hadn't registered any of their trademarks, and they ended up registering 45 separate trademarks. So that kind of stuff, I don't think would happen anymore. I don't think anybody would say, oh, I forgot to register my trademarks. I don't think it's that bad. But you'd be surprised how many new entrants haven't bothered, didn't think about it, especially the Chinese name.
But what about the Parents Convention regarding well-known trademark protection? How does this work in practice in China?
Well, I don't know about the Paris Treaty, but the well-known trademark was always, recognized in China, and it's improved. It's become easier, the thresholds, but it's just always difficult. I mean, I think the thing is, people who are interacting with China probably often overestimate the awareness of English amongst the Chinese population. So, really, the vast majority of Chinese people, not surprisingly, speak Chinese, and even people who speak English, they think in Chinese. And so, even if you've got a famous brand, like Coca-Cola, as an example, for most Chinese consumers, I would still guess they don't know Coca-Cola. They would know the Coca-Cola, which sounds similar. So that's probably not a good example. But if you would, like Penfolds had a big case. Penfolds, the Australian wine company, which they finally won after, I don't know, 12 years or something. And one of the issues would be Penfolds may be famous in China. Probably hard to really prove it because, what's the category? Is it wine? Is it Australian wine? Is it food and drink? Is it a product? So that's hard. But then even more so, is it really famous amongst Chinese consumers, or do they just know the Chinese name? So yeah, look, it is possible, but I'm sure 10 years of litigation will be more expensive than $600 of registration fees.
That's probably not worth it. Just one last question regarding trademarks. As you mentioned, have a Chinese name, do it early, do it quick. Do I need a Chinese entity to file for a trademark?
No, you don't. And I mean, one thing we should say about trademarks, which I think is kind of interesting, is, those trademark squatters, I can understand that Western companies, they get upset when someone's registered their trademark. And, I remember I was, in a meeting in London about 10 years ago, and the company was actually a retailer. So they hadn't registered in China because they didn't think they would set up a retail operation in China. And e-commerce had just started and they were getting orders. So then they found out that somebody had registered their trademark in China, which they were very surprised about. And they knew about it, but they didn't know how to find the person. And so, I was a bit surprised because I said, well, he's a trademark squatter. He's not the one-armed man from the Fugitive movie. Like, his goal is not to hide. His goal is to be found, because that's his whole business model. He wants to be found and he wants you to buy the trademark. And, people get very emotional with the trademark squatters, but, really, in most cases, it's best to buy your trademark back at a reasonable price than fight it through the courts. And then, in some cases, you see, people do fight, takes many years, and then if they're not careful, they can win and cancel his registration, but someone else has another application ahead of you in the system, and then they get it. So, so I think with trademarks, well, if you find out, that your trademark has been registered by somebody else, don't go to war. Think about the best way, and talk to somebody about how best to do it. But yeah, on your question, there's no reason. You don't need to have a Chinese entity to register a patent or trademark or copyright in China.
Okay, that's good to know. Thank you. Let's move over to copyright. Could you just walk us through copyright real quick?
Yeah, okay. So really quick on that. So, I mean, copyright's not something that you see that often. I see it a little bit more now because we've got more, software as a service type clients and digital clients. And so copyright, unlike the other two, it just gets, because of the treaties, copyright is just established by the act of creation. But Chinese, it is possible to do a voluntary recordal. It's, again, relatively inexpensive, actually is inexpensive. You can also do it for computer software, and it doesn't affect the source code. It's not publicly available, and we've got a lot of clients who are very computer software dependent. But you've got to remember, probably 80% of reverse engineering in China is software related. So it's important. And what's great about it is you get a big certificate with a big red chop on it. And I think this will scare off your competitors. If you have that kind of stuff, it helps firstly psychologically, but secondly, if you really want to go and sue somebody for your copyright infringement, this really changes the balance, because basically that's prima facie evidence that it's your copyright. So copyright, not many people think about it, but if you're really a digital business or software is a big part of your business, you should definitely think about registering.
You mentioned reverse engineering. If I do voluntarily register my copyright, reverse engineering is not allowed anymore, or how does that work?
Well, reverse engineering with the copyright, it depends how much they did it. Though, I mean, this is a complicated area because the lawyers don't understand the technology, and technology people don't understand the law. But what I understand is it becomes very complex. But with the reverse engineering, there may be big passages where they do copy. So I think the question would be how to protect your software. And most people just find it too difficult and they don't pursue those claims. So I'd say in order, trademark claims are the most obvious. Courts understand it. They're very likely. Patent cases would be the next likely one. But then the courts will often involve the Chinese authorities. That's why I think Chinese courts are better than arbitration, I would think. And then copyright is something you rarely see. And trade secrets you see more, but people feel more nervous because it's very hard to evidence infringement with trade secret.
Before we go to trade secrets, just one last thing about copyright. Let's say I do not want to voluntarily record with the CPCC. Am I still protected? Or in theory, I guess yes, but in practice?
Yeah, you don't need to register copyright. It's by creation, it just exists. But it's the evidentiary burden, and you won't have that certificate from the Chinese government saying it's your copyright.
Could you walk us through trade secret real quick, Mark?
Yeah, so trade secrets, I mean, that's the most complicated one. It's also not very clear always what it means, but it can be know-how. So a lot of companies, say chemical industry, they'll have process know-how. There's no registration. You have to keep it secret. You have to have confidentiality measures in place. And this isn't necessarily just IP. This might be also client lists, calculation methodologies, a lot of stuff. So, very often these cases are when an employee leaves, starts their own business or joins a competitor. Where they seem to sometimes work is if a Chinese competitor has hired people away from you, and then that Chinese competitor is looking to do an IPO. That seems to be cases where Chinese and foreign plaintiffs might jump up because it's the strongest time for leverage, for an IPO, especially if it's on the Star Exchange, because that's all IP-based type companies. So trade secrets, lots of discussions, difficult to prove, but make sure you've got an NDA in place, make sure you've got your employment contracts have confidentiality clauses, but no matter what you do, it'll always be quite a challenging case to deal with.
All right, thank you for this quick overview. Obviously, when we move away from the legalities, there are lots of nuances when you are especially starting to do business in China. I've taken a few out of the book, and I think it will be interesting to dive into these a little bit deeper, starting with the first one. Let's say you have a Chinese partner, maybe you're doing IP or not. In the book, you recommended when it comes to IP that starting a foreign-owned entity, a WOFI in China, from an IP protective point of view, is stronger than if you were doing a joint venture. Could you maybe elaborate on that, or if it's not true anymore, because that was back in 2005?
Yeah, I think things, are more complicated. I mean, I think, it's, the joint ventures, back in 2005, most companies that were setting up, real investments in China, they were B2B companies. They were manufacturing, not for the consumer, they were manufacturing to supply the automotive industry or things like that. And I think also back then, a lot more, the foreign investment guidance catalog was much more prescriptive and much more restricted. So now we have a negative list, and so basically most things you could set up your own company. But back then there were quite a lot of companies that felt compelled to do joint ventures, either by the law or because they believed you'd have to deal with a big Chinese company. Say in the automotive industry, you do a joint venture with the large Chinese player because then they would also help you get the contracts. So I think in those cases, it was different back then. I think the foreign companies were perhaps more naive about protecting their technology, and the Chinese companies were perhaps a little bit more reckless about, acquiring the technology. And I think China was different back then. I think, firstly, there have been some legal changes, like the forced technology transfers have been, stopped by the foreign investment law, but you didn't see that in many sectors anymore anyway. I think nowadays, the issue is, even if you have a wholly foreign owned enterprise, somebody within the company can leave with your technology, etc. So for sure, a joint venture probably is more risky, but it really depends on the facts. So I think it's harder than it used to be. And I think, perhaps in the past, it was about manufacturing something, and now it's really about, dealing often directly with consumers. And China is now a technological powerhouse as well. So I think what's going to happen is more technology companies will bring the technology here. And the issue will be, how do you protect your foreground or background IP? How are you able to, get royalties to do it? I think it's become much more complicated. It's not as easy as it used to be to say, joint venture bad, woofy good. So I think it's more complicated.
You mentioned a negative list, and I don't know if everyone that's listening or watching us knows what that is, but I remember from one of our previous episodes that people can find on YouTube and the KWN website, is that a negative list is a list of restrictive sectors and areas that foreign entities are able to operate in. You can correct me if I'm wrong on that. And on top of that, you mentioned forced technology transfer, and that's something you sometimes still read in the news about China. That's something that's completely not at hand, at play, when it comes to foreign entities in China.
Well, I think, it's no longer possible for the legal kind of forced technologies. I think, it was never as bad as people said, I don't think. I think, but, where it was in those larger sectors. I mean, the ones which I can think of immediately is the automotive sector, because there were these technology transfers required, localization was required. In order to do localization, you'd have to do technology transfers because, a lot of those parts had to be also in the rail industry. So we have a lot of clients who are in the rail industry, suppliers. So it was through the supply channel. And so I think that has kind of departed to a degree. And I think now when we're talking about technology licenses, things are moving quicker. So firstly, that doesn't exist anymore, but it still exists not as a legal requirement, but it may be in procurement. They might say, oh, we want a Chinese, or we only will give the order to a Chinese joint venture or something like that. So it still is in the back door, but it's not like it was 15 years ago. But still, something to tend with.
Thank you for clearing that up, Mark. If we take a look at the second point, employees, it describes that policies and procedures that might be a good thing to implement in terms of protecting your intellectual property. Could you maybe elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, so I think, firstly, like trade secrets, like I mentioned, there is an obligation in order for you to even claim that you have a trade secret. You need to have confidentiality measures in place. So, I think, again, it's always about making things not just on paper, actually living them a little bit. So I think, it's not good to have a blanket 2 pages of IP protection or business secrets, right, in every employment contract. So, that, the guy who's guarding the gate is under the same obligations as the head of the R&D department, so because people don't take it seriously. Like I said, look, I think trade secrets is difficult to evidence, but, it's also very frustrating when you've got a case and then you have to listen to people, you know, first the lawyer will tell you, oh, if only you had it in your employment contract, oh, all this. And then other people in headquarters will say, oh, if only you had that NDA. Look, I know that it would still be very hard to enforce, but people will not, you know, shut up about it. So I'd say, firstly, it's practically relevant because at least, you know, it means that you have a system of protecting your IP and your trade secrets. It's communicated to the employees. They know what they're doing would be wrong. So I think, you know, you sometimes have to still spell things out because you can't always assume Western practices, you know, will be the same in China. And then, you know, secondly, it's a bit of a cover yourself in case there is an issue. At least you can say, well, we do have something on writing. Because otherwise, you know, with the reverse engineering, this stuff, people will say, well, why is what they're doing wrong? You know, so I think that's it. It's not a magic bullet, but you should, you know, put it in place.
So if you have kind of countermeasures in place where you have company policies and you make your employees sign it, they're aware of it. Let's say something really does happen. The authorities would be more in your favor if you can prove that you had these kind of countermeasures in place?
Well, I don't think they're going to like put a siren on the top of the car and run around. So I think, yeah, the authority, it's probably not, but it'll be something people say, well, where is that document? So I think, you know, for trade secret cases, whenever we've had these kind of cases and people want to appeal to the authorities, look, you know, there are IP, you know, authorities and there's a way to do it. If you don't have it in place, then I think, again, it's like the trademark, which you haven't registered. You kind of really made a difficult situation impossible. But I can't pretend that, you know, that you have something written in the contract, then suddenly everybody's going to jump to attention.
When we take a look at our third part, we talk a little bit about pirates. Could you walk us through what are the potential dangers and counters we could implement against pirates?
Yeah, so pirates or counterfeiters, I think pirate just sounds more exciting than counterfeiters. Yeah, so I think, you know, so there's different buckets of these guys. So, you know, perhaps the trademark squatters, then there's the counterfeiters, you know, people who really make your product and sell it. And, you know, the biggest victims perhaps of those kind of fast-moving consumers are the Chinese consumers who buy it. And, you know, specifically, you know, cases involving pharmaceuticals or foodstuffs. And there's been cases where, you know, Chinese consumers, you know, have died or, you know, been seriously injured by using those products. So I think in China, a lot of people do take this very seriously. And we often, you know, it seems to be, you know, the idea of DVDs or T-shirts. And I don't know who buys DVDs anymore, you know, if anything. And so I think, you know, so Chinese consumers are often the biggest victims. And they can be criminal proceedings. So, you know, people are doing something which endangers public health or massive operations. But you can also go to the administration. So look, I think our IP litigation team has never been as busy as it is. And so maybe pirates should be pirates, counterfeiters, and infringers. Maybe we should say that because, you know, a lot of the infringers will be perhaps your Chinese partners, you know, where you buy stuff and they reverse engineer it. And, you know, it will be, you know, civil action. I think in the courts they're awarding ever larger damages, so it actually makes sense and it's really a good deterrent. And then administrative proceedings, you know, they tend to be quicker and, you know, easier to do. But, you know, you also have to make sure who you're dealing with, because I remember there were some unethical, you know, law firms. And one case was that company I just mentioned before, with something they had like 25 or 40 trademark registrations they hadn't done. And, you know, we gave a quote and then the guy got very upset. And he said, oh, I got another quote from a Chinese trademark agency in Shenyang. And they offered to do it for like a quarter of the price of your price.
That's
and
nice.
So I said to the trademark guy, I said, oh, how could that be? He said, oh, it's impossible because, you know, over 50% of our bill is official fees. So because the trademark application takes 1 to 2 years, what they do is they take the money, they never make the application. And, you know, in 2 years, when you find out it's too late, they've moved on again. So, yeah, and then, it was even more exciting. There were investigation firms, in South China who were doing movies of, AIC raids, so it was really like a bit of a Hollywood production. People would enter a factory, seize goods and all this. And, the client was happy, but they found out actually it was all staged, that it was just the investigation firm, selling them a movie. You don't hear about that as much in the past. But so I think with, pirates, you have to really look at your product. You have to look at who's copying it, who's infringing it, and then work out what you can spend effectively. And really, every company be different. We had one company that was working with diesel engines for big ships. And I asked them, do they have any IP protection? And do you have like spare parts? Because that's always complicated, And they said, well, anyone who buys one of our engines, the spare parts, they will only buy from us, because if that engine stops moving for 24 hours, it'll cost them so much money. So they'll never, ever, but not many people have that. So, I think it's difficult. I don't want to avoid the question, but this is something really, it depends on your product, your market, who's buying it, who's copying it, who's infringing it. It's difficult to just,
Just one questions regarding pirates, let's say. I sometimes hear people complain that there are too many facilitators in China, that a third party or someone is reselling your software, for example, online, and these third parties are kind of facilitating that. Do you agree with that? How can people work with these third parties to prevent that from happening? What are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, again, it depends what you're doing. We have one client who does sell software, and their software is then hacked or, cracked, and then it's being sold on Taobao by people, for less than the price of a sandwich, So, and this is like not one guy, it's like 100 different Taobao vendors selling it. And so we came up with a thing with our trademark guys, because, Taobao, those kind of platforms, they also don't have a big interest in selling counterfeit products, but there's a process. And so we call it search and destroy. So once our trademark guys will check on a regular basis, like who's selling it, who looks like they're actually a bit of a problem, and then a letter will go out, and then Taobao will take them off. There's a process. But then these guys will tend to open it. So it's not about putting those guys in jail. It's just about disrupting their business. And, these guys have been doing it for a year, and the problem's gone down. So I think, every case has to be looked at. I mean, I'll give you another example of an inventive case. Was we had a client that was a high-end spirit manufacturer, and they found that, their most expensive, it wasn't Johnny Walker, but let's say, the most expensive Johnny Walker is Johnny Walker Blue. Yeah. So it's much more expensive than the normal bottle you buy. And so they were selling like a very high-end product, and their problem was in third or lower tier cities, they'd be selling to karaoke bars and places like that. And what these karaoke bars were doing was they were keeping the bottles and then refilling, or getting bottles made or whatever, and refilling with whatever very, very cheap stuff. And so what we did there, this was a while back, we actually would start a case against the karaoke bars, like a very local small case, not thinking that we could get help from the administrative authorities, because if you're that kind of karaoke bar in the third tier, drinking bootleg alcohol is the smallest of your transgressions. There's much more happening there than that. But what we thought is we start these little cases, and then we would publicize in the local media that this case is happening, because, the guy in a fifth tier city who goes to the karaoke bar and pays like, 3,000 renminbi for a bottle of alcohol, and he finds out it's actually only saying that would cost 20 renminbi, he's the guy you'd be scared of if you were the karaoke guy. And so that worked well. And, once you would start that kind of threaten, the idea was to move those karaoke guys out of self-preservation to real product. It wasn't like to attack whoever made the cheap alcohol, because that would never ever stop. But the distribution chain. And so those guys were just compelled. They found it, instead of making 10,000% margin, they were making like 1,500% margin. And so it was easier for them to buy the real product. So I think you can't just ask a lawyer, because the lawyer will always have some theoretical thing. Look at your situation and work out what's best.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. And I'm sure that the karaoke bar knew what they were doing.
No, they were filling it in. So, I mean, it's without any doubt they knew what they were doing.
I've put on the screen just a small overview of what people can go through in order to protect their IP in China. And what I learned from this episode is I think that people need to be aware of it. They need to stay on top of it. Let's say they're applying for a trademark in their home market. Try to do the same in China. Think about it ahead of time. Come up with a Chinese name. Are there any things that you would like to add to that list, Mark?
So I think might be worthwhile just quickly running through it. I mean, I think we've said it, but it's sometimes good just to stress it. So I think first and foremost, register your trademarks in China in all relevant classes. Get the Chinese version. And also, I mean, one thing we didn't mention, you will have a Chinese name. Once you're in China twice, you will have a Chinese name. And if you don't come up with your own Chinese name, the market will probably come up with a ridiculous name for you. So it's important, to do that early. Make sure that you register your patents. If you do it in Europe or the US, probably worthwhile registering in China too. Look at other patent forms if you're too late. Use a reputable IP agency or law firm, because, it's important that these things are done properly. And one thing which I think is interesting is I would really get technical personnel involved, because I think the IP protection, it's not illegal. I mean, it is legal, so you've got to know the laws. But like I said before, the problem is a lot of lawyers, they won't understand the technology, and the technology people don't understand the law. So it's good to have technical personnel involved. And it may not be stuff that goes into the documents, but I remember one client we had, they had a certain type of truck. And, the IP was mostly in, the computer software, which was, if someone would get access to it, they could, reverse engineer it. But the way they did it is it was housed in a way, the only way you could get to it was to destroy it. And so it's those kinds of things, or remote kill switches in production equipment, things like that. Yeah, and one of the concerns I always have is, of course, when we start drafting something, we use a template contract, something which we've used in China before, and we've seen things. But so many of these kind of like OEM contracts, which are very IP heavy, because you have to protect the IP, people will change my grammar, but they won't have one new idea. And that's always a bit of a concern, because, I don't know their product very well. So you'd think that they would have some good ideas. And so I think very often the engineers or your technical guys, they will have some real world strategic ideas how to protect your IP. So that's, I think.
But Mark, is it expensive to do all these things?
But I would say for the trademarks and the patents, you have to do it anyway. The trademarks, even if you don't want to come to China, I would just do it anyway, because things might change. Patents, well, you might regret it, and it will be that. The contracts, I guess you're doing business in China, and so that would be part of the cost of business in China. But I'd be surprised if the lawyers are more expensive in Europe, and I'd be super surprised if they're more expensive than somebody in the US.
And definitely make sure to use a reputable IP agency or law firm, because what you said earlier is that it can take 2 years, I think, for the registration to go through. So
well, I think that was back then. I think nowadays it's 12 months for the trademark, but that's only because of the opposition period being, like 6 to 9 months. So it's, it's not because of things moving slowly. It's just the system, that there's a period for people to look at the trademarks and things like that.
And make sure to remain paranoid, but don't hire a paranoid lawyer, right?
Well, I never thought of it that way. Yeah, I think we can go overboard. I think with the contracts, think about it, think strategically, but sometimes people have contracts which almost spell out how to breach them and gives people ideas, and it can be hard to, negotiate. So I think, I'd say with the investment with the contract is, let's say it's a sourcing contract, so protect your IP, ensure you own the molds, have an idea how you'd exit, and then that can be in the contract, but also have an idea how you would exit in real life, and that would be the way. And try to avoid a situation where you just put yourself strategically in an impossible position, because very often we see contracts where the Chinese supplier has invested in machinery, has invested in the molds, and they have a contract for, say, I don't know, 4 or 5 years, and it's an American contract. It says New York law, New York courts, and then the American company wants to terminate the contract without notice, and so you got the Chinese supplier sitting on this $1 million investment. What's he going to do? Of course, he's going to continue to manufacture the product. So don't put people in that position. And then, of course, if it's a New York law, New York courts, you'll probably win in New York, but you're not going to be able to enforce in China. So, yeah, Pyrrhic victory, I would guess. So, yeah, make it.
And if people want to learn more about contracts and other China-related issues, we've started our series, China, the Art of Law. People will be able to find it on our YouTube channel or the KWN website. If anyone has any further questions, we would love to hear them. Mark's contact information is right here on the screen. Thank you, Mark, for joining us on this episode, special episode for Haidian Pioneer Park. Mark, if there's anything else you would like to tell the audience, now is the time.
Okay, well, thanks for it. Look, I think, one issue is, our interest is, as a law firm as well, is just to help, Western companies come into China, and, IP and technology is a big part of that. So, if anybody, found this interesting and they would just like to do a bit of a sanity check about their plans to enter the China market, if they can drop us an email, we'll be happy on a free of charge basis to check if their trademarks look okay. And, we can also have a bit of a chat about their specific, situation, and just, perhaps red flag anything they should be aware of. So that's something we can easily do for, our friends from Haidian Industrial Park. That'd be something we'd be happy to do.
That sounds perfect. Thank you very much, Mark. And if anyone is interested in that free trademark check or a free consultation with Mark and our team, please send an email to either Haidian Pioneer Park or Mark's email address that's right here on the screen. And we look forward to hearing from you. Once again, thank you, Mark.
Okay, thanks, Jerome.